On almost every day, God said it was good, or God saw that it was good, except Monday. And that confirms all of your worst suspicions about Monday. There is no blessing on Monday. So we'll look at Genesis 1:1 to 2:3, which is a poem. I want to stress that this is poetry and that really matters. This is not a science textbook. So I know that might be disappointing to some of us if you're nerdy. And I am nerdy. I count myself. I'm very interested in this. I look at this also from the standpoint of I studied engineering, and so we'll talk a little bit about that, but I want to stress that this is poetry, and Hebrew poetry rhymed concepts. They didn't so much rhyme sounds. There's a little bit of that, but they rhymed concepts. And what you'll see is the rhyming of concepts. The first question was, how does this story sound compared to other creation stories? On a simple level, everyone either has an origin story or is interested in origin stories. Like kids, when they're really little, when we're really little, we ask these questions like, "Where did you come from, mom and dad?" Well, okay, where did they come from, right? Like, and then it's who made God, right? Or if that's the way the story goes, everyone is kind of interested in origin stories, and especially if these origin stories compare and contrast with other origin stories that are being told, then that that really does matter. For example, do I think that evil has always been a part of the origin, right? Like if God is evil, like good and evil, like if he's evil, then we're stuck with evil forever because there is no removing evil from the world, from the universe, and from my life if evil was there at the very beginning, right? And so if you like the happy ending story, or I mean, I know it's fashionable to be cynical and to say I'm not childish. I don't fall for these Disney happy ending stories, but it it's not just happy ending story. It's justice triumphing over injustice. It's goodness triumphing over evil without becoming evil itself, right? Like, how does justice triumph over injustice without becoming unjust? How does beauty triumph over ugliness without becoming ugly? If your origin story says, actually, good and evil were the same thing and it was all joined together, mashed together, then you're never going to be free from it. And there's not really a good rationale for fighting it now, whether in our personal lives or in society. Another I think it's a pretty ugly story, is there's a variation on the Greek story where Zeus makes men, as in males, right? Like Zeus makes a lot of males, and then we're supposed to produce food for the gods. And instead, Prometheus teaches us how to use fire, and then we do all these things. We become technologists, and Zeus gets really mad, and so he gets even with everybody. So he gets even with Prometheus by chaining him to a rock, and this eagle or vulture like rips out his liver every day. And because he's an immortal, he just regenerates his liver. But the same thing happens the next morning. And he gets even with men by creating women. He creates Pandora and women, and Pandora comes with this box. And that's where we get the story of Pandora's box. And she opens the box, and all these insects and evil things come out. And so there's a lot of chaos that happens in the world. I don't think there's a lot of detail there, but that's the kind of accidental, capricious, retributive nature of the creation story in the Greek world, or at least one of them. And it's pretty mean to women. The violent interpretation of things, like Marduk has to slay Tiamat, and then life just scattered, or it's just more spillover from the chaos. The implication would be, well, maybe we too could use violence that way. I just want to stress how important that is if you're an Israelite person and you're enslaved in Egypt. because your experience, maybe some of the propaganda is, no, you are created to be our slaves and to feed the gods that we have. But the story that you're holding on to is, no, we're not. No, we're not. So one of the major differences is we're not the result of some cosmic accident. Actually, in the Genesis 1 story, in the poem, we are the deliberate forethought there of a God who cares about life and relationship and flourishing. We are not created to be slaves for that God. So important. In fact, it sure seems like the created world is a temple of some sort, right? And we are the image of the kind of the statues, but not statues of stone. We're living images of God in this temple, and we're walking around, we're supposed to do things, and yeah, it's pretty different with God saying, this home that I've created for you is a temple. It's good. This is good, that's good, that's good. And by the end, it's very good. So one point that we had made last time is, compared to the stories today, let's say that you're a strict materialist, and as far as as far as we know, there's kind of the story of strict materialism, which is there's the Big Bang, and that's kind of mysterious, but here we are, right? And we're the result of what? Some kind of cosmic accident. Maybe there's life out there on other planets. As far as a law of thermodynamics, so that everything is kind of winding down to coldness and death. Well, if that's the story we live in, then what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be running around on this planet? Is there any purpose? And that it's hard to answer with great positive ringing visions of, yes, it means something, sacred and high. Instead, it's, well, I don't know. Who knows how long we'll survive here? So we can still do that. The comparing of stories. And I think that is really important. We want to let our hearts just kind of soak that in. That surely is something kind of on the big story level right away that we can apply. Like, well, if this is true, then we have a sacred high calling. And what it means to be human is huge. What other patterns do you notice? Did anyone try to read the passage out loud, and did it sound different to you? Did you hear something different when you did that?
I'm noticing like the number of times it says good and when it says things were good versus when it just says it was so. And so I thought that was interesting, but that's also in contrast to this narrative saying that this is even good and not um, you know, not neutral or negative.
And how does that strike you, Sonia? Why did that strike you?
I think um yeah, I think it strikes me that I mean it's just a very high view of creation and people and of just every like it's a high view of things and like that they were good and balanced, like, they were fine, and it wasn't like out of some disaster or fear or um, yeah, like that there was something wrong, somebody did something wrong, or somebody needed to die. It wasn't violent like that.
It's astounding that to some that the material world would be considered good, right? So I was raised semi-Buddhist through my mom's influence. Well, there was a statue in my grandmother's house, and it was a representation of the Japanese version of Buddha, which is he's kind of a large, overweight man, and he has his eyes closed, arms folded, and he has a smile on his face because what he's communicating is, I don't see it, and I'm not affected, and so I'm content. And part of that is rooted in the idea that the material world, like the physical world, is not real or not as real as something else, like the possibility of going to nirvana. But what that means is then it has this eyes closed, arms folded, like I have to ignore things, or I get to ignore things perhaps, and that's the posture, right? Like, especially if we're like somehow slaves to the gods and we're just our life is miserable, because then the lesson would be just keep it moving. Like, yes, there's this stuff here, but just keep it moving. This story, the Genesis story, is very different. It's We're supposed to look at the created world and actually learn at least some things with an interpretation, but we look at it and say it's good. If God made it good, then there's something about God that we're supposed to see in the created world. What is that? Let me say just a few things about day, morning, and evening, just to get that out of the way. We might have questions about, are these 6 or 7 24-hour periods? Like, is it a 24-hour day? I don't think it is, partly because on day one, God makes light, but then on day four, there's the sun, the moon, the stars. So what is going on there? Like that, we could come back to it, but I think that there's something else besides just a 24-hour period. Um, and all the words like day, morning, and evening can be used in multiple senses. So we talk about the day of the automobile as compared to the day of the horse and carriage, right? Like or this is the dawning of a new day, even though it's not just like one sunrise that we're talking about. So I want to point out that even in the very next chapter, in chapter 2, verse 4, Genesis says, in the day that the Lord God made the heaven and the earth. What day was that? Right? So already the word day is being used in the sense of something like an era or an epoch, right? There's some like longer period of time that's not 24 hours, and it can mean that. And so can morning and evening, like the dawning and the closing of an era. So we do speak that way. And I hope you don't feel like this is something to get hung up about, because some people, I'll just call them fundamentalist type readers, who would say, what, Mako, you're not taking this literally? And my pushback to that is, there is no such thing as taking things literally, right? And I talked about that last time. And the example that I used was, I'm mad about my flat. What does that mean? It could mean, if you're in the US, it could mean I'm angry about my flat tire. But if you're in the UK, it probably means I'm happy about my apartment. I'm mad about my flat. How do you decide what is being said there? Like, what's meant? Even though you know the words, you don't know the meaning until you know the context. And so there, the issue is, what context are we reading this in? Right? Like, so the whole 7 days, morning, evening poem, what is the context and what is the literary context? So the issue is not, am I being literal or not? Because there's no literal, like, I'm mad about my flat. Is there a way to take that literally? No. There is just taking it contextually, in context, in the literary context in which you are. So there's nothing irresponsible about reading day, morning, evening as meaning something much broader in time. So let me say that, and then also, how can God create light before the sun? Right? Like the sun he makes on day 4, or it sounds like that. But the thing is that Hebrew did not have a past perfect verb tense. In other words, the past tense is God created. The past perfect in English is God had created. So what it means is, whenever there's that kind of situation, Hebrew is less specific about how you sequence things in the past. So this probably means, I think it's very likely means that God had created the sun on day one, and only that there's something in the atmosphere, the debris, the vapors, like the waters, settled down sufficiently so that you could see the sun, the moon, and the stars. Because what happens on day four? The sun, the moon, and the stars start to govern the day and the night. It doesn't mean that they were created just on that day. I would also say that this is the earth this is the creation of the earth, or God getting the earth ready from the perspective of standing on the earth, right? Like, and in that sense, I think it's pretty good. And again, let me say I studied engineering, and so I have this nerdy, sense of like, well, how close is this to a scientific account of or what science suggests to us about like how the Earth was. Actually, it's pretty good, right? Like, because if you're standing on the earth as it's cooling enough, like so that the vapors settle, you do see something about light and darkness even before you see the sun, right? Because there is some kind of atmosphere, even if it's really filled with debris and dust and all these things. But as it settles, then the sky becomes clear. And, the whole sequence of, well, there's water, sky and sea, land, and then there's plants, animals, humans. That's pretty good. The introduction, right? Verses 1 and 2 sound like an introduction. So by the time really the scene opens, like, I mean, Genesis 1:1 could be the introduction. This is how God made the heavens and the earth. And this is, so in other words, this is not the Big Bang, right? That's something else. It's fine to coordinate that, like we can reflect on that, but this is, hey, the earth is here, and we're actually looking at the stabilization of the earth as our home. So light and then the contrast of light and darkness, day one. Day two, so it separates the moisture above, right? Like everyone can observe, like the ancients can observe, hey, sometimes it rains and snows, like there's like water up there. So, okay. And then there's, of course, water down here. So separating them, there's sky. So God is separating things. That's another pattern which we're going to see later, but I want you to notice it here, that God makes something good and then he separates it, right? And both things are good. Yes, thanks, Jeremy. Differentiation is not a negative thing. He creates ice cream and then he says, let's make more flavors of ice cream. So, yes. And I want to point out in verse 11, here is something where if you study um, Earth history and from a science point of view, you would say, hey, wait a minute. We actually think the first vegetation was not seed bearing. It multiplied by some other dynamic. It's like spores or something. So I just name that because I want you to notice that when I say that, it doesn't make me worried, right, about Genesis. Why is that? Because it's the broad category of thing. They still multiplied somehow, right? Number one, like the main emphasis is God makes life, living things to multiply, to make more living things like itself. It gets the point across. So notice day 4 matches day 1. Day 5 is built on day 2, right? I should say that day 4 is built on day 1. Day 5 is built on day 2, and the realms now have inhabitants. And then day 6 matches day 3. Of course, on day 6 we have animals, land animals, and then humans. Now, this is what's called the framework interpretation. The pattern is God first makes realms and then makes rulers and inhabitants for those realms, right? So it's almost like if you're getting ready to bring a pet home, you build an aquarium, or you buy an aquarium and you stock it, and then you fill it with water, and then you bring in the fish. Because if you just buy fish, then they might come in that plastic bag, and you might not have enough time to like transfer them from the plastic bag into something that they can live in. You build the habitat first, and then you can bring in the inhabitant. Same thing here. God builds the habitat first and then brings in the inhabitants, or creates them by speaking. Basically, if God makes inhabitants for that are fitted to their habitations, then he must have a home for me. He must have a home for us, right? Like, again, like if one place that the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt, and we're wondering, like, is this where we belong? Like, is this all we're meant for? And to live in a story where God takes care to build a habitat, a home, and then welcome the inhabitants into it, man, that's different, right? It builds a sense of both, it, I mean, maybe a sense of outrage, like, so this can't be it. And then, right now, but also a sense of hope. Like, there must be some restoration that's already is legit to hope in. So that's what's called the framework interpretation. So and then in day 7, God rests. And the idea there is like he reposes on a throne. It's not like God was tired. He rests like a ruler sits on a throne, kind of rests to survey everything and says it's very good. So let's back up. And now that we've observed these things, what do you make of all this? How come God didn't like just make everything all at once? Why did he take a long time? And what is gained by God doing things this way? And Jeremy says, on that note, it shows God values process. Things take time. Yeah, God is not like worried about time, or things taking time, and relationships or relationality takes time too. How are we supposed to get to know God over time? Our lives, and our spiritual life especially, are not microwavable things. I know we live in a microwavable society, so we want things instantly. We want to grow instantly. We want our characters to be like fixed or better instantly. It doesn't happen that way for most things. So, but here we see the pattern already. God takes time.
God built these things. It's not just like throwing things together. It's like there's order. Like he made vegetation, they have seeds. That doesn't appear in other places, like, okay, with animals, beasts of the earth after their kind, the cattle after their kind, creeps in the ground after its kind. So yeah, it says like after their kind a lot. So like that order, that kind of categories, logical categories, you know?
Yes, yes. There's some way in which God designed life to already be bearing more life. God makes things that are prepared to make more life after their kind. Very critical. It's so beautiful. We are co-creating life with God, right? The habitation, the habitat is for also us to partner with God to fill it. And so that is really amazing. Like, that, to think that we're partners with God in caring for life, and even nurturing life. Now, in this particular case, we were introduced to like Adam and Eve early on, and so we that's why we think this is a married couple, like at the very beginning in Genesis 1, where it is where God says, "Let us make the human one." That I took the liberty of kind of straddling the two translations, the New American Standard and the New Revised Standard. Those are my two favorite translations. But in this case, I felt like it was important to get that it really is ha Adam. You could say God said, let us make Adam in our image, male and female, because at that point, Adam is the species, like the human race name. And then only later, when Eve is created, does Adam become the name of the particular guy. So Adam and Eve. And so here, but here it's a generic name. This is the name for humanity. It's Adam in Hebrew. And so the human one, Ha-Adam, is the one that in male and female that is able to produce life, produce more human life. And that fits with everything else. Like, how are we supposed to partner with God? Well, here we go. There are other relationships too. Marriage is not the only relationship that we have, but you get the idea, right? Like, this is the beginning of the character of human relationships that we're called to reflect.
These verses where it uses like subduing and then ruling over the animals,
Yeah.
essentially, and stuff like that, which is in the previous verse. Rule over the fish. Yeah, let us make the human one in our likeness and let them rule over the fish. Blah blah blah. That a lot of that language, I don't know. I feel like as a faith community, it's been a difficult one because it has a domineering aspect to it, like it has a negative connotation. So I don't know, just comments on that. It's like as a warrior mentality, subduing.
Yep.
So yeah.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it's because we live in the wake of Protestantism, which is connected to capitalism and colonialism, that we have an exploitative connotation to these words. So that's not what it originally meant. And you could see that especially in the Greek Orthodox tradition, where they are more interested in the natural world as art, as something beautiful that we're supposed to get to know. And so their approach to things has been like, okay, this rock is marble. How thin can we cut or shave down this marble so that the sun shines through so that the light shines through it? What are its properties? And part of why they do that is because of their tradition of Christian art. And it's called iconography, where they're interested in colors because there's connotations connected to those things. So it's more of a combination of art and science as opposed to capitalist exploitation, right? Like that what is our relationship supposed to be to the natural world? And that's especially true. We see that because this is how God cares for the natural world, right? So if we are the image of God and we're supposed to bear his likeness and be like him, then we're then we have to ask, does God exploit the world for like his own benefit? Is that what we're supposed to do? Is that what subduing things means? No. um but Joshua, we'll look at that next time, especially because then we'll see that there's a garden beginning. And I think many of us have gardened. uh the the act of gardening is an act of subduing like a certain area of land, so it reflects your sense of beauty. Because you know yes, thank you for these comments. Dominion is like a mastery of a craft, grows through attentiveness and cooperation with the creative order versus coercing or torturing the results out of the natural world. And Yelena says, like they shall beat their swords into plowshares, spears into pruning hooks, like in Micah 4. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war, excuse me, war anymore. Yeah, and the very next line is, and every person shall sit under their own fig tree, right? It's a sense of there's a garden and each person has a share in it. That's the beauty of it. And there's already a moral character that we're starting to see in Genesis 1, of how we're supposed to relate to the creation. We're supposed to care. There are appropriate boundaries so that lives can flourish, and especially human lives can flourish. So we'll don't want to say too much about that now, but there's already the foundation built here.
This is again belaboring the point slightly, but it's like, the subduing. I like the word mastery because you get the sense, but also it's like, but then if you think about it in a negative way, some of these things, mastery, like, and subduing, I think perhaps some of these things end up being tied to like negative ways that Christians have thought about our subduing or mastering over, like, for example, your relationship dynamic with your wife, and like the kind of that downward dynamic of like I control you.
Yeah.
But if you look at the word subdue or mastery and these kinds of words, all the synonyms, there's ones that are positive, like possessing great skill, technique. But there are ones that are negative. So I don't like it seems like our misunderstanding from like the very beginning about these ideas could have caused so many fundamental problems very, very early on.
It could have, right? And one of the challenges is Hebrew, biblical Hebrew, as far as we know, has somewhere, I think like either 6,000 or 8,000 words total, total. English has millions of words, right? Because English loves to, first of all, collect other words and also develop subtleties and more precise meanings. Hebrew is a more poetic language. It's like Spanish in that way. So again, we have to be really attentive to context, especially the relational context of how these words are used. It might interest you to know that for the early Christians, Genesis 1 was very much live as a moral vision for life. And this was actually their primary anti-slavery abolition text, right? It was everyone was supposed to have a share in the creation to be able to participate in its bounty, right? And so if you're kidnapping someone or buying someone from a slave sale, you are interfering with Genesis 1. You're interfering with that person's ability to share in the mastery of the creation in an appropriate way, right? And then you think about a whole bunch of other things that are connected to that. But it is amazing, right? So for the early church, Genesis 1 is live. It still has incredible meaning for us, ecologically and economically. Well, so one application of this, like now that we've done some observing of the text and we have a sense for like what did this mean then? What does it mean for our understanding of God? And what does it mean for our understanding of one another and our lives? So what it means for our understanding of God is God calls us to partner with him in caring for life and in making more life in different on different levels. And I understand as Christians, we come back to this. There are more things that Jesus talks about in terms of spiritual life. You could be like, for example, a spiritual father or mother, not just a biological one, by mentoring others, for example. There's also a relationship to the natural world that we really need to think of, because if God has called us to partner with him to care for life in a way that is wise, bounded and good, then yeah, um, that's both a trajectory of creativity, perhaps. So if you're an artist or into the sciences and wanting to know, like, what is it that we're doing? Like, the foundation is here. Um, but ultimately, it means how do we relate well, right? And so, how do we relate in a way that leads to life flourishing and life being cared for? So, because God cares for life, and that includes caring for people's spiritual lives, physical lives, emotional lives, just different aspects of our lives. So that does include, I think, helping people to know the God who cares for life, the and Jesus who came to restore life. So if there's something that you feel like God is calling your attention to, there's someone, their face comes to mind, their name comes to mind. So for me right now, like it being Father's Day, and my dad is an 88-year-old stroke survivor. He lives in my house now. We brought him into our home from California to Boston in 2021. It is not easy to relate to my dad. There are many things that are challenging. And one of the things that he has dementia, so it is especially challenging to me when he says, like, I don't know why your mother divorced me. I'm like, you are making me so mad. Like, I'm ready to scream at you. But slowly, what I've been trying to do is to help my dad. There's an element of narcissism there, so I've been trying to help him apologize. So I, I have said to him, like, Dad, um, he gets upset about something like in the morning, of course, like when we wake up in the morning, we start to make noise. We're walking around, we're opening and closing doors, and if he leaves his bedroom door open, he hears all that and he complains, like he yells sometimes, like, you guys are making so much noise. And it'd be easy for me to bite back and to say, you're an idiot. I try to have some humor and to say, like, well, Dad, I've told you you could close your door. And you know, he did live alone for over about 20 years. So I understand, like, it's hard to adjust, right? Still to a situation where you're basically living in community, including our foster daughter, right? So um, so I get that it's hard. And so I think, and I hope the sympathy comes through as well. Um, but that doesn't mean I just give in. There's good boundaries, right? And more often than not, my dad is able to stop, to step back, and to say, "Oh, yeah, you're right. I'm sorry." He never said I'm sorry when I was growing up. So over the last 3 years that he's been living with us, that is one of my major goals and hopes for him, because he's still not, he doesn't know Jesus. I mean, he would say that he's an atheist, but I feel like in terms of his character, like the softening, and some of the being challenged, I think he's more able to, I feel like if he meets Jesus now, he would be a little more able to say, "Oh my gosh, I'm sorry." Right? That has been my hope and goal with my dad. That is the one thing, because that is what leads to life. So what is that for you? Right? Like, I'm sure there are people in your life that God has given you an opportunity to be an agent of blessing, to care for their lives as well as your own. So there may be ways that you hear something in this, in our time, that you feel like, oh, yeah, I want to pray about that more. I want to think more about that. Please do that. I do want to make one last point. 7 and 10 in the Bible, these are numbers that have associations of completion and also foundation. So 7, obviously, like that means completion. And so I'll point that out later. 10 means kind of a new foundation for something. And so you might think also of 10 commandments. Is that a coincidence? I don't think so. You might also, like just before that, God speaks 10 times on Egypt and makes 10 plagues, so to speak, and he relaxes the boundaries of creation so that water comes over the land and starts undoing creation in that limited field. Is that a coincidence? I don't think so. It leads to the a pattern, right, where biblical writers start to perceive that God does things in a patterned way. And this is really important for us because how does how does God speak to us, or not how does God speak to us, but the fact that God speaks to us is is different than just well, I'm just going to read the tea leaves, or I'm gonna read the parking lot to see if I get a parking space, and I'm going to interpret God's character based on, does that fit me? Um, that's not what we're supposed to do, right? Like, we're supposed to get to know God by what he says. And so that's the other thing. Like, I'll be calling that out in the future, but I wanted to name it here. We have the privilege of getting to know a God who speaks very personally to us. There is a way in which we are called to prioritize that. When he promises something, when he commands something, when he tells a story about something, like there's a way in which that breaks into, that's his way of breaking into a fallen world where, if we were just to look at the universe and say, well, it sure looks like it's going to wind down to a heat death of coldness and, death. Like, it looks like this is just life is just a cosmic tease or something like that. Well, no, because God has spoken, right? And he says, I'm going to win. I'm going to bring more life. And here's how you can participate in that. This is what it means to get to know a God who can interject into the cosmos. Like, he can speak into our lives, into history. And what he says, it creates a new basis for our relationship with him. Okay.